start, if that's okay with everyone. I'm sorry we had a few technical problems before we could start the meeting. I'd like to welcome you to this meeting marking the 70th anniversary of the formation of NATO, organised by this Truth and Memory Preparatory Committee. And after the success of our meeting last year, Truth and Memory, the real story behind World War I, 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, we thought it would be good to take this work forward, and it would be equally important to uncover what was behind this NATO alliance. You know, that in recent times has been destroying and creating mayhem outside of the United Nations and inside the United Nations, invading and toppling governments in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere. And I think one of the main contentions tonight will be the claim of NATO that it is a military defence organisation. So we will see from our speakers how it stands up to that, and of course start with discussions on what the alternative is to settle conflicts between nations and peoples in the modern world out of NATO. So I'm very happy to have two speakers tonight, both who spoke at our last meeting. Our very own Keith Hussein, a lecturer in international politics, a member of our preparatory committee who actually came up with the idea of a series of meetings under Truth and Memory, and also Hakim Adi, welcome back to Hakim Adi, a professor of history at the University of Chichester, specialising in the African diaspora. The programme tonight is we're going to have a short film on the formation, just on the formation of NATO. It's only a couple of minutes, and then. If the microphone's working, David's going to read a poem, a Norwegian poem actually, because Maddie and I were just in Norway a few weeks ago, and we went into the museum and saw part of the military museum is the Museum of Resistance. The whole floor is dedicated to the resistance of Norwegian people against fascism. And there was this wonderful poem on the wall, written in 1936, and the poem has been revived actually recently by the youth, because if you remember a couple of years ago, some tragedy happened when these socialist youth were attacked on an island, and many of them were killed by this deranged fascist, and it was used at the memorial service. So anyway, we'll have that poem. And then Keith's going to speak on NATO, and he's going to speak for, I think, about 25 minutes, and then we're going to have depending on the time, we've got a protest video at the Washington, short video about the protest in Washington against the NATO summit just a couple of weeks ago. And if we've got time, we've got a 6-minute video about the NATO's interference in support for Saudi Arabia and interfering in Yemen. And then we have keynote speaker Hakim who's going to speak after that, and then we'll have questions and answers and discussion, and close the meeting after that. So without further ado, I'd like to ask David to show the first film and then read the poem.
In May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO.
So that was a propaganda film. Can you read the poem then?
Faced by your enemies on every hand. Under a bloody storm, they'll make us stand. Fearful your question, defenceless, open, what shall I fight with? What is my weapon? Here is your battle plan, here is your sword. Faith in this life of ours, humanity's worth. For all our future's sake, seek it, defend it, die if you must, raise and sustain it. Silent the weapons go, row upon row. Hold your drift to death, stop it with spirit. War is contempt for life, peace is creation. Throw your power in, the reaper will falter.
Thanks, David. So without further ado, I'll ask Keith if you'd like to.
Thank you, David. Today I'm really going to talk about NATO, obviously 70 years on, whether it's still fit for purpose, whether it still sort of serves the interests or the sort of goals that it was originally designed to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of give you a series of slides, talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall, then maybe say something about how NATO was redefined during the War on Terror, and talk about two recent NATO interventions in Syria and the Ukraine. And then I'll briefly finish off by talking to you a little bit about maybe how NATO could be reformed or sort of restructured for the sort of challenges that we face today, which are far more important than things like war. I mean, environmental, the sort of environmental threats that we face now are quite significant. Okay, so next slide, please, David. So, the year 2019 is marked by some very, very interesting commemorations. And among these is the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Obviously, you can see the landing of Allied troops there in France. But it's also the anniversary of Russia's, or the Red Army's, breakthrough into Axis-held East European territory. These were the two decisive events that changed the course of the war and defeated fascism in 1945. This year also marks the 70th anniversary of the creation of the US-NATO military alliance. It's also 25 years since NATO became a joint partner with Ukraine with a view to membership. And this was one of the factors that led to the recent civil war in that country. It's also 15 years since the Baltic states, as well as Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, took up NATO membership. So the organisation has expanded within this time. Next slide, please. So, sorry, David, can you go back there? My mistake. 30 years ago, if you can have a look at the bottom picture there, in 1989, people's expectations were completely different to those of today. The fall of the Berlin Wall and communism in Europe marked what was thought to be the end of the Cold War and 3 decades of tense relations between Warsaw Pact and NATO countries. This tension had occasionally opened up into very dangerous military flashpoints in which the two powers came close to all-out global conflict, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Six-Day War, and also the Vietnam War. Back in 1989, within the new spirit of public optimism that marked the end of the Cold War, it was assumed that a peaceful relationship of mutually beneficial trade and cooperation would now exist between NATO countries and the newly democratized Russian Federation. Perhaps most significant is the 20th anniversary of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic's membership of NATO, which began the organisation's controversial eastward expansion towards Russia's borders. NATO's expansion came about despite assurances to the contrary given to Mikhail Gorbachev by the Bush administration and prominent Western leaders such as Helmut Kohl, Francois Mitterrand, and Margaret Thatcher. Next slide, please. After 1989, I'm afraid, all of these promises, all of these bets became null and void. The entire justification for NATO's existence pretty much vanished after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It found itself adrift and without a viable role in the new post-Cold War world. However, any hopes of establishing new international relations based on mutual coexistence themselves soon disappeared. The Clinton administration at that time continued to pursue NATO's ambitions in Eastern Europe despite the fall of the Berlin Wall. It took advantage of Russia when it was in a greatly weakened economic state to further increase the US military presence in the region. Under the presidency of Boris Yeltsin, Russia was compelled by the IMF to open up the economy to private global capital and bring about market reforms which were pushed by the US, UK and European countries, with utterly disastrous social consequences for the Russian people. Average income, quality of life, unemployment, mortality all worsened considerably under Yeltsin, as the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, demanded further market reforms that plunged the country into a social and economic crisis in what Naomi Klein has called shock doctrine economics. Basically what we mean here is where countries are forced into a fire sale of their state assets and forced to undergo extensive privatisation, cuts in social provision, welfare, services, etc. Now we come to the war on terror, humanitarian intervention and regime change. Just looking there at that image, we can see the sort of spirit of Glasnost when Gorbachev and Reagan attended the sort of peace summits that happened around in the late 80s, early 90s. But also you've got a little graph there of what happened to life expectancy in Russia, male life expectancy, when it was forced to undergo these reforms. It looks like, life expectancy sort of plummeted something like 15 years, and it's sort of recently recovered, sort of halfway back up to where it was before the fall of the Soviet bloc. After the 9/11 attacks on New York, Washington, George Bush's Republican administration further redefined NATO's role as central to the new war on terror. Rather than an organisation set up to safeguard against the spread of communism, as originally claimed, it would instead fiercely promote the concept of regime change in so-called rogue states that posed a threat to the US and its allies. Indeed, in the wake of 9/11, the Bush government identified at least 6 countries: Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Syria, Afghanistan and Libya for possible military intervention in the future. Their moral justification for confronting these nations was that they formed an axis of evil, which was supposedly able to supply nuclear, biological or chemical weapons, what became known as WMDs, to their terrorist clients. All of these charges were later found to be based on entirely spurious premises, such as the British government's dodgy dossier. You may remember that. It was one of the justifications that was used to launch the Iraq War. And in fact, this set in place a common pattern where countries were bounced into joining into armed conflicts on a very misleading basis. This form of manufactured consent, as Noam Chomsky, the philosopher, termed it, warned that Iraq was actively engaged in a full-scale WMD program and that this could successfully be used against countries like Britain within 45 minutes of an order being issued. Next slide, please. And obviously you see the sort of claims, the sort of lurid claims that are made there in the likes of the tabloid press. 45 minutes from attack. Dossier reveals Saddam is ready to launch nuclear war strike. And they never ever found these sort of chemical or nuclear weapons facilities, I might add. So it was that the role of NATO was radically redefined from one that sought to contain perceived external threats to one which sought to eradicate them altogether. And we've witnessed this in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine. In the last decade, it has also adopted an openly confrontational stance towards Russia, even though that country hasn't intervened beyond those territories which are in its traditional sphere of influence when trouble broke out. We're talking about places like Georgia, Chechnya, and the Ukraine. Nearly 20 years after 9/11, we now have a widely held perception of the US as a rogue superpower, operating under the cover of humanitarian intervention. Accordingly, it assumes an unfettered right to force regime change on countries which don't fit into the models of Western neoliberalism and market reform. These are nations that have simply chosen to protect themselves against the excesses of global markets and all the social fallout they entail. All of these recent interventions have, without exception, brought about massive disastrous effects on the countries concerned, including intense civil conflict, massive civilian casualties, and full-blown humanitarian crises. My mistake. Next, I'd like to move on to Syria and the Ukraine. Next slide, please, David. The recent conflicts, I've just given you sort of example there of sort of regime change, the image of Saddam Hussein's statue being pulled down. I think it was Tahrir, no, that's in Egypt, isn't it, Tahrir Square, is that right? I can't remember. Anyway, it was in central Baghdad. And of course, after several years of intense US bombing, the country was reduced to rubble. Very much like the pattern that we've seen in Syria, Libya, and also the Yemen, which isn't a NATO intervention, but otherwise I would have covered that. The recent conflicts in Ukraine and Syria provide clear evidence of the human cost and suffering caused by these policies. They also follow the twin aims that NATO and the International Monetary Fund have of attempting to secure economic on the one side and geopolitical on the other side advantage in these countries. In each country, moderate social tensions and protest among the populations which were genuine were exploited by non-governmental organisations or NGOs such as the National Endowment for Democracy or the White Helmets, supported by NATO and Western governments. I think what I want to underline here is this is one of the new ways of fighting warfare nowadays. It isn't simply a case now of sending 500,000 troops into a place and then sort of invading it. Quite often it's all about battle for hearts and minds. It's about manufacturing very, very dubious consent for military action. And these private organisations like the National Endowment for Democracy, the White Helmets, have played a key role in this. I have a clip here by Professor Marcus Papadopoulos, who's an expert on Russia and the Ukraine. And I'd like you to all hear what he says about the Western intervention in Syria, and also what his research into the White Helmets tells us. David, if you could give me the first clip, please.
Well, with me now is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First and an expert on Russia. Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you very much for coming in. Thank you. Thank you.
NGOs like the White Helmets and the National Endowment for Democracy have been used to create social unrest and political instability in countries such as the Ukraine and Syria. These range from activities like producing fake news reports, supporting neo-fascist and jihadist militias, to terrorising local populations. Besides having well-established relations and close cooperative ties with Russia, these countries are also at the centre of major international disputes over energy supply and food production, which has helped push each country into bitter and costly civil wars. Next slide, please. Now, if you'll see there, this is really the origins of why the Syrian war started. You've got two alternative routes there, one going from Iran into Europe and one going from Qatar. In 2009, Syria's President Assad refused to sign up to an agreement with Qatar to build a gas pipeline from the Gulf through its territory into Europe. That's the blue one there. And instead opted to support an alternative project through Iran and Iraq, which are two of the country's major allies. Qatar and Saudi Arabia bitterly opposed this decision and then actively sponsored the operation of militant jihadist forces in Syria in response. There was even a well-publicised spat between King Bandar and Vladimir Putin in the run-up to the Sochi Olympics, if I remember correctly. Okay, so these so-called friendly rebels, which the government tried to spin these groups as, took a major role in what was ultimately a failed attempt to unseat the Assad government, which is aligned with Lebanon and Russia. On balance, NATO simply provided cover for another Western military intervention and proxy war using these private organisations, and it was driven by economic interests above all else, rather than any concern for the Syrian people. Next slide, please. The Ukraine crisis, which unfolded in 2013, presented a difficult problem for NATO, and NATO, as a result, is now heavily encroached and active on Russia's borders. Yet we hear all the time that Russia presents a threat to the West. Historically, the majority of the country is culturally tied to Russia, though it's split between the extreme nationalist north and centre. Is that right? Well, I've got west and centre there. North and centre. Supported by Western powers, and the heavily Russian-orientated east and southern areas around places like Donbass, Dnipro, which is the sort of major river you can see running through the south, and Odessa. All of these areas want to preserve the long-standing economic and cultural ties with the Russian Federation. Furthermore, this ethnic tension is heightened by a long-standing split in the country, roughly along those lines, that came about in the Second World War. The North and Centre supported its Nazi occupiers, notably through Ukrainian fascist leader Stefan Bandera, who's still supported quite heavily in the country, while the South firmly supported the Soviet Union and now Russian Federation. This legacy has led to recent renewed disputes over language, civil rights between the two regions that currently underpins this conflict. And if I believe correctly, I think Russian has actually been banned as a language in public spaces within the sort of northern regions of Ukraine. What spurred the conflict was a European Union free trade deal which was offered to its president, Viktor Yanukovych. This was later rejected by Yanukovych and his government, which led to protests in the Maidan Square by what was called the Euro-Maidan movement. Again, quite heavily sort of influenced and directed by non-governmental organisations like the National Endowment for Democracy. So these protests were whipped up by NGOs, visiting Western officials, sympathetic news reports, which served to encourage what was a manufactured coup d'etat in the country, which led to the downfall of its government. Can I have the first slide, please? The next slide, please, David? So you can just see some images there of the type of movements that have emerged in Ukraine. As the violence escalated into 2014, as I said, Yanukovych was overthrown, replaced by Petro Poroshenko. Civil war broke out between the two factions, but Poroshenko's government enjoyed the full support of NATO as well as neo-fascist political parties with quite dangerous militant wings such as the Right Sector, Azov Brigade and Svoboda. Svoboda actually have launched as a political party, and there's some examples there. We've got I think that's Svoboda there, if I have a look at that, if I can see that sort of fascist symbol there, and torchlit parades in commemoration of Ukrainian fascists like Stepan Banda are very, very common in the country. Pity that we just don't see this on news. Vladimir Zelensky, would you believe, who's a stand-up comedian aligned to powerful corporate interests, has since won the election and replaced Poroshenko this month. What will happen from now on, I don't really know, because very little's sort of known about it. He sort of emerged out of nowhere. But what I would like to show you is a German state broadcast from late last year. I think it was I think it was 2017. And what it looks at the influence of far-right groups in the Ukraine. David, if you could play the second clip, please.
Ukraine above all, death to our enemies. The Azov movement holding a protest march outside the Justice Building in Kyiv. The Azov movement's principles appeal to young women and men alike with an interest in working out and fighting for their country. Fertile breeding ground for the Azov leadership and its radical political goals.
So, I'm sure you'll all agree with me there, that's quite alarming. First of all, you've got NATO and Western forces sponsoring groups like the Azov Brigade, Svoboda, basically openly fascist organisations which are now incorporated into Ukrainian politics and Ukrainian security forces. So I think that's utterly terrifying really, and it's something very typically that's been ignored by much of the Western media, but I'm very, very glad that German state television produced a series of interesting reports on that. So, while guerrilla forces in the southern region successfully fought off a Kyiv-backed military offensive in 2016, the danger is a beleaguered Trump administration may just escalate the Ukraine conflict to win favour with Washington military officials and also fend off persistent allegations of collusion with the Russian government. I have the Mueller report coming in a couple of days, and it's likely to be probably damning. So it's just really really interesting to see how Trump responds to that with regard to Russian relations. The increasing encroachment of NATO forces onto Russia's borders and the Baltic region under present NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has ramped up an already dangerous political tension, which you can clearly see there. It has also caused the deaths of tens of thousands, severe economic ruin, and the displacement of millions of refugees, which is just the latest in a series of unsuccessful, deadly conflicts in Europe and the Middle East. Okay, final slide here. I'd like to say a little bit now about whether NATO can actually be reformed. And it's something that you all might want to think about. I'm not coming up with any hard and fast answers, but there is a question and answer session where any queries, any sort of anything that you'd like to ask, any views that you might have, you'll be able to air. Warfare in the context of present offensive weapon systems, whether it's nuclear or non-nuclear, is so dangerous that it cannot be regarded as a sane instrument of policy, let alone official NATO policy. Common security measures are required which seek to build trust and cooperation to prevent destructive conflict and to build local and global security based upon fairness. In this sense, it is clear that the present NATO strategy in Eastern Europe and Middle East is entirely contrary to that goal. A new emphasis at all times must be placed on forms of peaceful assistance to local and international organisations working to resolve conflict, to protect local culture and sustainable practices, to engage in genuine mediation and the building of strong democratic institutions, and to build links between the peoples of conflicting communities. For the first time, we have a Labour leader and potential future Prime Minister committed to international peace and social justice, who, once in office, will make this a serious priority. In those desperate situations, where this becomes impossible and some form of military intervention involving UK troops is necessary, in the immediate term, to prevent conflict or extreme or sustained oppression, I would argue that this must come under the more democratic mandate of the United Nations rather than NATO. There is little or no threat of direct invasion to the UK, US or European countries by any nation. Commitment to large military forces is therefore no longer necessary or fit for purpose. There is an urgent need to recalibrate NATO policy firmly within a legal remit bound by the defence of sovereign territories and their right to live together in peaceful coexistence. The sale of armaments to overseas nations should also be subject to much stricter ethical consideration, so that they are not used unilaterally or with naked aggression against other nations, as in the case of Saudi Arabia against Yemen at the moment. For those of us, and I'm sure I speak for everybody in this room, who are committed to international peace and mutual coexistence, the question is whether it's actually possible to reform NATO so that it more closely resembles a socially just organisation, or whether something else entirely different should take its place. Thank you.